they should instead be called from inside some of our other components and pages. So actually what we want to do here is we don't just want to manage values which are then accessible by different components, but also functions that will change those values that are accessible from different components. And hence we can expose pointers at these functions to our different components as well. So in our context here, we don't just have the values for our favorites, but we also can add functions there. We can add an add favorite key, for example, which stores a pointer at the add favorite handler as a value. So we don't execute the function here, we point at it. And that exposes this function defined in this component to all components in this application that are interested. And you will see how to use this context in our components in just a second. And we can therefore also add remove favorite here and point at the remove favorite handler, and add the item is favorite key and point at the item is favorite handler function. And now we expose these functions to all interested components as well. Now that that's the case, I will also go to my initial context and add those keys here as well and set that to empty functions that just get the correct parameters. And I'm only doing this because that will actually give us better autocompletion later. It doesn't really do anything here since these are functions that don't do anything, but it will help us with autocompletion in the IDE later. And that's why I will just add them here to the initial context as well. Okay, so now with that, we spent a lot of time in that file, and I could imagine that it's not all 100% clear yet, but we're now done with working in this file. Now we need to wrap our context provider around all components that want to interact with this context. And then in the different components, we need to pull out the values we're interested in or call the methods, the functions here we defined. And for that, we need to export this favorites context provider component here by adding the export keyword in front of this function. And also, maybe at the bottom of the file, export the context as itself, the favorites context itself, as a default. So we have two exports, this function here, which we export by its name, and then this default export, which is our favorites context itself. These two things are exported here because we need to interact with both objects, with both things from outside this file. Now let's start with interacting with this favorites context provider component. I mentioned multiple times that we want to wrap this component around all the components that are interested in our context data. And in this case, the My Favorites page will be interested, the navigation bar will be interested since I want to show a badge here, and the All Meetups page will also be interested, or to be precise, the Meetup item components will be interested, because there I have this To Favorites button, which, for example, should trigger the Add Favorite handler. So I have various components from all over the app that are interested, and hence the easiest way of providing the context is probably to wrap everything with it. So here in index.js, I will import the favorites context provider from the store folder, and there the favorites context file. And actually, I'll wrap it in curly braces because I don't want the default export, the context object here, but I want my component function instead. This favorites context provider function, which I export like this under its name. And we import named exports between curly braces. That is standard JavaScript. Now we can wrap this provider component around the browser router and the app. And with that, everything, all components in this application are able to interact with this context. Now, how do we interact though? Let's maybe start with the meetup item component. Here we have this to favorites button. I want to make sure that when this button is clicked, we add this item to our context. And I also want to update the text on the button depending on whether this item is already part of my context or not. And actually, if it is part of the context already, if we already did favorite a meetup item, this button should no longer add this item to the context, but remove it from my favorites array in the context. Hence, first step is to add a function in this meetup item component, which we could name toggle favorite status handler. The name is up to you though, and I'll bind this function to the onClick prop of this button, so that when we click this button, this function will be executed. And now in this function, we will need data from the context. We need to find out whether this meetup item is already part of the context or not, and then do different things depending on that information. Now for that, we now need to tap into the context and get values from there. And we do this with help of another hook provided by React. And that would be the use context hook. This hook allows us to establish a connection between this component and the context, simply by calling use context here and then by passing the context object to which we want to connect as our argument. And here I'm not talking about our favorites context provider component, but about the context object which we created with create context, which is why I'm exporting that as a default as well. With this in meetup item, we can import the favorites context, like this, so that default export from going up, store favorites context. And it's then the favorites context which we pass to use context. And that now gives us access to this favorites context object. So to this object here, which we're distributing through the value prop to all the components. So to this object will have access now inside of meetup item. That's the object which is stored in this favorites CTX constant now. And now we can, for example, find out if this item, this meetup item here, is a favorite by using this favorites CTX constant and calling item is favorite. So this method, which we defined on our context there as well. This method which points at the item is favorite handler function. We execute this function now by executing it here in the component like this. And we need to pass in the ID of the meetup for which we want to check whether it's favorite or not. And we get the ID of this meetup through props. There is this ID prop which we pass into our meetup item here when we render it. So we can use props.id to pass the ID of this specific meetup to item is favorite. And that will return true or false. So here we then have that response. Now here in the toggle favorite status handler, we can check if the item is a favorite. So if this constant has a true value. And if that's the case, we know that we want to remove that item from the context now when that button was clicked, because it is a favorite already, which means now we want to get rid of it. So then we use our favorites CTX constant, this context object, and call remove favorite. And remove favorite also wants the meetup ID, so we pass props.id here. Else, if the item is not a favorite yet, we call favorites ctx.add favorite. And here we need to pass in a new meetup item now, so I will construct an object on the fly and simply set my ID to props.id, the title to props.title, the description to props.description, the image to props.image, and the address to props.address. And that now recreates this meetup item and passes it as an argument to the add favorite function, which in the end triggers this add favorite handler function in this favorites context provider component. And that will then update the state there, add this item to the user favorites array. And because the state was updated, it will update all child components because this component here as a whole will be updated, and hence the JSX code with all the child components will be updated again, and hence all components will have access to that latest state now. So that's how we can now trigger a state update to this global state, this favorite state, from inside the meetup item component. We change some state which is not managed in this component, but on a global level. And now going down to this button, we probably want to change the caption, depending on whether the item is a favorite or not. So I'll output something dynamic here as a caption and check if item is favorite. So I'm using this constant here again, which has true or false as a value. And if it's true, then the button should say remove from favorites. If it's false, so if the item is not a favorite yet, the button should say to favorites, because then clicking the button will add the item to the favorites. And now that was a lot of work. But if you did all of that, if you saved this, now you should be able to reload and click to favorites, and it should change to remove from favorites, and back and forth. We don't see the favorites on the My Favorites page yet, but adding favorites does work, as we can tell by this button. Now let's make sure we also render the favorites on this My Favorites page and that we have a little badge here.